My arrogant white brother-in-law accused me of a felony at the Sunday dinner table, sliding a cease and desist order over my collard greens. He thought he was putting a disgraced, disbarred paralegal in her place. He had no idea the presiding judge would soon flee his courtroom in terror at the sight of my federal file. Growing up in Atlanta, Sunday dinner was sacred. My parents, Reverend Thomas and Yvonne, led a prominent megachurch. Image and respectability were the currency they traded in. The dining room table was a battlefield, and I was the casualty. I am Valerie, 33 years old, and the biggest disappointment to carry my family name. 5 years ago, I was a rising star prosecutor with a flawless record. A scandal shattered my career, stripped me of my law license, and reduced me to a struggling paralegal. They saw me as the black sheep. What they did not know was that I had willingly surrendered my state license to accept a covert recruitment from the Department of Justice. For half a decade, I had been a federal investigator specializing in judicial corruption. This evening was supposed to celebrate the historic Church Community Center renovation. My older sister, Alicia, sat across from me, her flawless silk blouse matching her expensive highlights. Beside her sat Trent, her 38-year-old white husband. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. To them, his connections guaranteed elevating the church prestige. I was quietly finishing my meal when Trent suddenly reached into his designer briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them directly onto my plate. The heavy paper landed squarely on my food, splashing hot gravy onto my wrist. The entire table went dead silent. My father paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. My mother gasped, clutching her napkin. "Practicing law without a license is a felony, Valerie." Trent leaned back, his voice dripping with condescension. "Consider that document a formal cease and desist. If you ever tamper with my firm business again, I will have you arrested by morning." I calmly wiped the gravy from my skin. "What exactly are you referring to, Trent? Do not play dumb." Trent slammed his hand on the table. "You went behind my back to the Community Center Planning Committee. You took the real estate contract I drafted for your father, reviewed it, and redlined 6 different clauses. You are a disgraced, disbarred paralegal. You have 0 legal authority to advise this church or cross out a word of my work." Alicia jumped in immediately, her eyes flashing with venom. "You are unbelievable, Valerie. Trent is working pro bono to save this community center. He is bringing in millions in investment capital to help Dad expand the congregation, and you decide to play pretend lawyer because you are jealous." "I am not jealous, Alicia," I replied smoothly. "I am literate. There is a significant difference." My mother slammed her hand down. "Do not speak to your sister that way. Do not speak to Trent that way. You are a guest at this table, Valerie. You should be on your knees thanking Trent for associating his firm with our church." I looked at my parents. The absolute blind devotion they had for this man was sickening. They were so desperate for validation they let him humiliate their own daughter. "He is trying to help us, Valerie," my father said, his voice booming with the authority he reserved for Sunday sermons. "You lost your right to practice law 5 years ago. You brought shame to this family. We forgave you. We let you back into this house. But I will not allow you to jeopardize the biggest financial expansion in our ministry just because you want to feel important again. Apologize to your brother-in-law immediately." Trent crossed his arms, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Yes, Valerie. I think an apology is in order. Unless you want me to call the district attorney tomorrow. I play golf with him every Tuesday. He would love to hear about a disbarred attorney handing out unauthorized legal advice. I can have the police at your apartment by noon." I looked at the cease and desist order sitting on top of my ruined dinner. Then I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me with raw disgust. I looked at my sister, who was vibrating with joy at my humiliation. Finally, I locked eyes with Trent. His arrogant grin was the look of a man who believed he held all the power. He thought he had cornered a broken woman. He thought he could use my past to silence my voice. I picked up my fork. I did not throw it. I did not yell. I simply pointed the silver tines directly at Trent. "I redlined those clauses for a very specific reason, Trent," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Your brilliant contract requires the church to use the community center deed as collateral for the renovation loan. But the loan is not coming from a traditional bank. The contract transfers 100% of the church equity to a shell holding company registered in Delaware in the event of a missed payment. My father frowned, looking confusedly between me and Trent. What holding company? Trent's posture stiffened. His smug smile vanished instantly. He uncrossed his arms and sat forward. You do not know what you are talking about, he snapped. It is a standard liability structure for high-risk commercial lending. Is it? I tilted my head, not breaking eye contact. Because standard liability structures usually do not involve routing money through offshore accounts. I read the entire document, Trent. Every single hidden addendum. You designed a predatory trap meant to force a default within 6 months. So I will ask you a simple question right now in front of my father and the pastor of this church. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper that echoed loudly in the silent dining room. Who owns the Delaware LLC, Trent? For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Trent's left eye twitched. The color drained from his face, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The trap was set, and he was completely caught inside. My arrogant white brother-in-law threatened to have me arrested for illegally practicing law right at our Sunday dinner table. He thought I was just a disgraced, disbarred paralegal. He had no idea that tomorrow the presiding judge would take one look at my file and run. The silence hung heavy after Trent slammed the legal cease and desist order onto my plate. We were in the middle of family dinner when he launched his ambush. Trent was my older sister Alicia's husband, a slick corporate attorney from a wealthy Atlanta family. My parents worshipped him. Practicing law without a license is a felony, Valerie. Trent leaned back. Consider that document a formal warning. Tamper with my firm business again and I will have you arrested. I wiped my wrist. What exactly are you referring to, Trent? Do not play dumb. Trent slammed his hand down. You went behind my back to the planning committee. You took the contract I drafted for your father and redlined 6 clauses. You have zero legal authority to cross out my work. I did not flinch. I pointed my fork at him. That contract transfers 100% of church equity to a shell holding company in Delaware after one missed payment. Who owns that company, Trent? Trent opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eye twitched. The trap was set. Before he could spin a lie, my older sister Alicia jumped in. Are you out of your mind, Valerie? Alicia shrieked. The crystal glasses rattled. She stood up, pushing her chair back violently. How dare you sit here and accuse my husband of stealing? Trent is trying to save this failing community center. He is bringing in wealthy investors. I kept my expression neutral. I am not accusing him, Alicia. I am simply reading the contract he drafted. A contract that strips our church of its valuable asset. You read it with the bitter mind of a failure. Alicia sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. You are just jealous. You cannot stand that my husband is a respected partner while you fetch coffee for minimum wage. My mother Yvonne quickly stood up behind Alicia. Your sister is right, Valerie. My mother said, her voice dripping with that condescending pity she reserved for me. Trent has spent weeks negotiating this deal. He is doing the Lord work. Doing the Lord work by routing church deeds to an offshore holding company, I asked. I just want transparency. Transparency. Alicia let out a theatrical laugh. You want to talk about transparency, Valerie? Let us talk about why you play pretend lawyer instead of actually practicing in a real courtroom. A cold chill swept through the room. My Uncle Marcus looked down. My Aunt Vivian cleared her throat. This was Alicia's favorite weapon. Do not ruin my husband's charity work just because you got caught tampering with evidence 5 years ago and lost your badge, Alicia shouted. You were a rising star prosecutor. You had the city in your hand and threw it away. You falsified evidence. You lied to a judge. The words hung toxic and suffocating. That was the official story. Valerie, the ambitious young prosecutor, caught tampering with a crucial evidence box. The scandal cost me my license, my career, and my standing. It was the reason my family treated me like a charity case. You are a disgraced, disbarred paralegal, Alicia continued, her face flushed. You are a criminal. Trent could have you arrested right now just for looking at a legal contract. He is showing you mercy by allowing you at this table. You are nothing, Valerie. You are a walking cautionary tale. I did not break eye contact. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her finish her tantrum. Reverend Thomas. My father stood up at the head of the table. He was an imposing man who commanded respect. Right now he was just a man blindly protecting his white son-in-law. That is enough. My father bellowed, his voice demanding obedience. Valerie, you crossed a line tonight that you can never uncross. Trent is a blessing to this family. He brought us financial salvation, and you sit here throwing wild accusations. I will not have it under my roof. Dad, if you would just look at the Delaware registration I started, but he cut me. I said that is enough. My father roared, slamming his fist down. You will apologize to Trent right now. You will beg for his forgiveness. If you refuse, pack your things and leave, you will not be welcome at Sunday dinner. You will be cut off from this family entirely. The silence was absolute. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for the broken, disgraced daughter to beg for scraps of affection. Trent had recovered his composure. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit and gave me an arrogant smile. He was waiting for my surrender. I reached over and picked up my napkin, wiping my mouth with deliberate calm. Then I stood up, pushing my chair back quietly. I did not look at Trent. I picked up my coat from the chair and slung it over my arm. I am not apologizing for reading a contract, I said, my voice steady. And I am not begging for a place at a table where I am not respected. My mother gasped. Valerie, do not do this. Do not be stubborn. I walked around the dining table. The room held its breath as I walked toward the hallway. Passing directly behind Alicia's chair, I stopped. I leaned down, bringing my face next to her ear. She stiffened, expecting an apology. Instead, I dropped my voice to a whisper only she could hear. It carried the weight of a 5-year-old secret I kept buried to protect her. We both know whose fingerprints were really on that evidence box, sister. I stood back up and watched the blood drain from Alicia's face. Her smug expression shattered into a mask of pure terror. Her hand trembled so violently that the expensive crystal wine glass she held slipped from her fingers. It hit the table edge and shattered, sending dark red wine spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like a pool of blood. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the dining room, but I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to look at the mess spreading across the pristine table or the panic bleeding into my sister's face. My heels clicked steadily against the hardwood floor as I moved down the hallway. I slipped into my wool coat. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of chaos. My father was shouting for a towel. My mother was consoling Alicia, who was hyperventilating. It was the perfect exit, but I knew my departure would not be that simple. Trent was not the type of man to let anyone have the last word. I pushed the heavy front door open and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. I made my way down the brick pathway toward my sedan parked near the edge of the sprawling driveway. Just as I reached into my pocket for my car keys, I heard the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut. Valerie. Trent barked, his voice devoid of the smooth southern charm he weaponized inside the house. He was marching down the driveway, his long strides eating up the distance. He ripped his silk tie loose from his collar, looking every bit the enraged animal. I turned slowly, gripping my keys tightly. I did not speak. I simply waited for him to close the distance. He stopped just inches from me, invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. He slammed his hand flat against the driver's side window of my car, trapping me between his broad chest and the vehicle. The mask was completely gone now. The generous philanthropic son-in-law who smiled for the church cameras was nowhere to be found. In his place stood the arrogant elitist who believed the world belonged to him. You think you are clever, do you not? Trent sneered, his breath hot against my face. You think because you read a few clauses and whispered some pathetic threat to your sister that you hold any real power here. You are nothing, Valerie. You died the day they took your law license, and the only reason you are standing on this driveway is because I allow it. I stared calmly into his pale blue eyes. You are sweating, Trent. I pointed out, keeping my voice perfectly even. Usually you only sweat when you are lying to a judge. He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You have no idea how this city works. He leaned in closer, his tone dripping with venom. You really thought you could step into my arena and play the hero for your parents' pathetic little church. This is the real world, Valerie. In the real world, people like me do whatever we want, and people like you take the fall. That is how the system was built. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. It was not the cease and desist he had thrown at my dinner plate earlier. He shoved it against my chest, forcing me to take it. That is a non-disclosure agreement and a transfer of deed, Trent explained, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I know your grandfather left you a 15% minority stake in that community center land when he passed away. It is the only thing keeping me from finalizing the transfer to my holding company tomorrow morning. You are going to sign away your shares right now, and you are going to sign that non-disclosure agreement, promising you will never speak a word about my business dealings again. I looked down at the paperwork and then back up at him. And if I refuse? Trent smiled, displaying perfectly white teeth. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. If you refuse, I will make one phone call. Do you know how incredibly easy it is to put a black woman with a tarnished criminal record behind bars in Georgia? He laughed softly, shaking his head as if the whole concept amused him. I have judges in my contact list who owe me their careers. I have police captains who attend my charity galas. I can tell them you tried to extort me. I can say you became violent and unhinged. Who do you think they are going to believe, Valerie? The wealthy white corporate attorney saving a local church? Or the angry, disbarred black woman with a history of tampering with evidence? They will not just arrest you. They will bury you so deep under the prison you will not see daylight until you are 60. His racism and entitlement flowed so naturally it was almost breathtaking. He had operated with absolute impunity for so long that he genuinely believed he was untouchable. He viewed my life, my freedom, and my family heritage as nothing more than minor obstacles he could crush with a single phone call. He stood there expecting me to break. He expected me to cry, to panic, to beg for mercy, just like my father had demanded inside the house. He expected the broken scapegoat to sign away her birthright out of pure survival instinct. Instead, I let out a slow breath. I looked at the crumpled paper in my hands and neatly folded it, slipping it into my coat pocket. You are keeping it, Trent asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. You need to sign it now, Valerie. I am not playing games with you. I know you are not playing, Trent, I replied smoothly. Neither am I. I appreciate you bringing this out to me. It will save my team a lot of paperwork tomorrow. Before he could process what I meant, I ducked under his arm. I smiled, got into my car, and pulled the door shut, locking it instantly. Trent pounded his fist against the glass, his face contorting with fresh rage. I put the keys in the ignition and started the engine. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway, leaving him standing there in the dark. Once I was 2 blocks away and entirely certain I was not being followed, I dialed a highly encrypted 8-digit federal number. Director. The target took the bait as we had planned. Initiate Operation Jericho. 3 days later, the sanctuary of my parents' megachurch was transformed into a glittering banquet hall. The annual fundraising gala was the crown jewel of Atlanta high society, underwritten entirely by my brother-in-law. I walked through the mahogany doors wearing a black sheath dress that cost a fraction of the gowns around me. I was not invited. My mother explicitly texted that my absence was required for family peace. I ignored it. I handed my coat to a bewildered volunteer and stepped into the main hall. The opulence was nauseating. Crystal centerpieces towered over tables covered in gold silk linens. Waiters in white tuxedos carried trays of champagne. This was supposed to be a place of worship, but tonight it was a monument to Trent and his ego. My parents were standing near the grand staircase greeting local politicians and wealthy donors. When my mother spotted me, her smile instantly vanished. She grabbed my father's arm, her nails digging into his jacket. They excused themselves and marched toward me with terrified urgency. "What are you doing here, Valerie?" my mother hissed, pulling me behind a massive floral arrangement. "I told you specifically to stay away. You are going to ruin this night for your sister." My father glared with cold fury. "You have incredible nerve showing your face after Sunday. Trent has been working day and night to finalize the community center endowment. He agreed not to press charges for your stunt with the contract. Do not test his patience." I looked at the two people who raised me. They were completely blinded by the illusion of prestige. "I am a member of this congregation too," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I have every right to attend a church function." My father's jaw tightened. "Fine. But you will not sit with the family. You will not speak to Trent or Alicia. You will sit in the overflow section and remain silent." He pointed a trembling finger toward the dark back corner of the room. I simply nodded and made my way to the designated table of outcasts, taking a seat next to the swinging doors where the catering staff rushed past. It was the perfect vantage point. From the shadows, I watched the evening unfold. Alicia paraded around the room, dripping in diamonds, playing the perfect corporate wife. Trent held court at the main VIP table directly in front of the stage. He was sitting next to a man I recognized instantly. District Judge Arthur Wallace. Wallace was notoriously corrupt, a man whose rulings aligned with whoever funded his lavish lifestyle. Seeing him sitting shoulder to shoulder with Trent, laughing and drinking expensive scotch, confirmed exactly what my federal task force had suspected. The trap was set, and the players were all gathering in one room. An hour into the dinner, the lights dimmed and a spotlight hit the main stage. My father delivered an introduction that sounded more like a worship service for his son-in-law than a prayer. He handed the stage over to Trent. The room erupted in applause as Trent adjusted his tailored suit and stepped up to the podium. He smiled the charming, predatory smile that had fooled my entire family. "Thank you, Reverend Thomas," Trent began, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "When I married into this family, I promised to elevate this church. Tonight, I am proud to announce a personal donation of $2 million to secure the community center renovation." The congregation gasped and erupted into a standing ovation. Alicia wiped a theatrical tear from her cheek. My parents beamed with absolute adoration. Trent held up a hand to quiet the crowd. "But progress requires restructuring." He continued, his tone shifting from generous to authoritative. "To protect this investment, we must modernize. We must hand control to those who understand law and high-level finance. And more importantly, we must protect our sacred institutions by weeding out toxic elements." He paused and his pale blue eyes scanned the room until they found me in the back corner. The spotlight did not reach me, but he knew exactly where I was. "We cannot allow bitter, disgraced individuals to drag down our vision simply because they failed," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We must cut out the rot to let the healthy branches grow." The congregation murmured in agreement, nodding along with their wealthy savior. They had no idea they were cheering for a man stealing their property. Trent's speech concluded to thunderous applause. He descended the stairs and returned to the VIP table, shaking hands and accepting praise. I sat by the kitchen doors, watching him lean over and whisper something to Judge Wallace. The judge nodded and pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, passing it to Trent. That was my cue. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I did not rush. I walked with deliberate, slow steps, navigating through the sea of tables toward the front of the room. My mother saw me moving, and her eyes widened in panic, but she was trapped in a conversation with the mayor and could not intercept me. I reached the VIP table just as a waiter approached with a fresh pitcher of ice water. I stepped right behind Trent's chair. "Excuse me?" I said softly, reaching past him. As I did, I deliberately bumped the waiter arm. The heavy glass pitcher tipped forward, sending a cascade of freezing water directly onto Trent's lap and splashing across the table. Trent leaped up with a furious shout, knocking his chair backward. "You stupid, clumsy fool," he yelled, turning to see me standing there. The anger in his face morphed into pure hatred. "I am so sorry, Trent," I said, offering a polite, empty smile. "It was an accident." As he frantically wiped his trousers, his briefcase fell open from the impact. The manila folder Judge Wallace had just given him spilled onto the wet tablecloth. My eyes locked onto the top document. Stamped clearly in the corner was the unmistakable crest of the Cayman Islands Grand Commerce Bank. It was the exact offshore account routing document my task force needed. The final missing piece linking the corrupt judge to the stolen church funds. Trent scrambled to grab the wet papers, but he was too late. I had already seen the crest of the Grand Commerce Bank of the Cayman Islands. That specific offshore account routing number was the exact piece of the puzzle my federal task force had been hunting for. It was the absolute proof of his money laundering scheme with Judge Wallace. Trent looked up from the soggy manila folder and his pale blue eyes locked onto mine. He saw the recognition in my face. He knew instantly that I was not just looking at wet paper, but that I understood exactly what those numbers meant. The arrogant smirk he always wore vanished completely, replaced by a flash of raw panic. He frantically shoved the damp documents back into his designer briefcase and quickly snapped it shut with a loud, sharp click. "You did that on purpose," he hissed through clenched teeth so the surrounding VIPs would not hear. "You are completely unhinged, Valerie." I did not respond. I just gave him a slow, knowing smile, folding my arms as I took a deliberate step back. I had what I needed. The bait was finally being taken and the trap was springing shut. But Trent was not a man who retreated. He used power to crush anyone who made him feel vulnerable. He looked across the crowded ballroom and caught the eye of two uniformed police officers standing near the exit. These were not random security guards. They were local precinct officers on Trent payroll, men who moonlighted at his corporate events and made his problems disappear. Trent gave them a sharp nod and a subtle flick of his wrist pointing directly at me. I saw the officers push off the wall and begin marching through the sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. Their heavy boots thumped against the polished floor. A ripple of confusion spread through the congregation as the two large men bypassed the rowdy tables and headed straight for the front. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. My mother, who was still talking to the mayor, froze mid-sentence as she watched the officers approach the VIP section. She placed a trembling hand over her chest, her face draining of color. She knew exactly who the officers were walking toward. The taller officer reached me first. He did not politely request that I step outside. He grabbed my upper arm with a bruising grip and spun me around. "Valerie, you are under arrest," he announced, his voice booming so loudly that it echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the church hall. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sound of the metal ratcheting open cut through the dead silence of the room. "You are being charged with the unauthorized practice of law and criminal harassment of a prominent community member." I did not struggle as he wrenched my arms behind my back. The cold metal clamped down hard, biting into my wrists. Gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. Hundreds of church members, elders, and local politicians stared in absolute shock as the disgraced daughter of their beloved pastor was handcuffed like a violent criminal in the middle of their sacred charity gala. Trent stood up, brushing the last drops of water from his suit. He adjusted his jacket and looked down at me with a triumphant glare. "I warned you to stay away from my family and my firm," he said loudly, playing to the crowd. "You just could not help yourself, could you?" Before I could even blink, Alicia was by his side. She buried her face in Trent's shoulder, staging a perfect theatrical sob. "Oh, Trent, it is just like 5 years ago," she cried out, her voice carrying perfectly to the nearby tables. She turned to the head pastor, who had rushed over looking horrified. "She is mentally unstable, Pastor," Alicia wailed, wiping away fake tears. "Ever since she lost her law license for tampering with evidence, she has been completely obsessed with ruining Trent. She is sick. She needs help we cannot provide. She is stalking my husband and trying to sabotage the new community center." The pastor looked at me with deep pity and disappointment. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, morphing into a low hum of collective judgment. I looked past the officers to find my parents. My father stood frozen near the grand staircase. His precious reputation was being stained in front of his wealthiest donors. I caught my mother's eye. For a split second, I thought I saw a flash of maternal instinct, a desire to stop them from dragging me away in chains. But then she looked at Trent, the wealthy savior of their church. My mother deliberately turned her back on me, facing the wall. My father did the same. They abandoned me to the wolves to save their own social standing. "Let us go right now!" The second officer barked aggressively as he started shoving me forward toward the exit. They marched me down the center aisle of the ballroom. It was a humiliating parade. The elders who had watched me sing in the choir, the community I was secretly working to protect, all stepped back as if I were carrying a disease. They muttered words like criminal and disgrace as I passed. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung open wide, and the thick, humid night air hit my face. The officers pushed me roughly down the concrete steps toward a waiting patrol car with its lights flashing red and blue. They shoved me against the side of the cruiser, patting me down before opening the back door. The taller officer grabbed my head to force me down into the cramped back seat. Before he could push me inside, I stopped. I planted my feet and looked back up the steps. Trent had walked out onto the portico to watch his victory. He fully expected to witness my absolute defeat. Instead, I looked right into his eyes. I did not shed even a single tear. I smiled. It was a dead, terrifying smile. I held his unbroken gaze as I slowly sank into the back of the police car, letting him wonder why the prey was grinning at the predator. The ride to the downtown precinct was quiet and suffocating. The two officers in the front seat joked loudly about how easy the arrest was. They laughed and said they had bagged a crazy woman who could not handle the success of her wealthy brother-in-law. I stared out the dirty window, watching the city lights blur past in the humid night. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply into my wrists, but I did not feel the pain. I felt only the deep thrumming satisfaction of a predator closing in on its prey. The trap had worked perfectly. Trent had reacted exactly as my psychological profile predicted. They pulled into the gated back lot of the station to avoid the public entrance. The taller officer grabbed my arm and marched me through the heavy metal doors. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sickening yellow glow. They did not process me at the front desk. They bypassed the booking area completely and led me straight down a narrow concrete hallway into a windowless interrogation room. The air inside smelled of stale sweat and cheap coffee. They shoved me into a metal chair. They removed the handcuffs, but locked the heavy steel door behind them, leaving me alone in the sterile room. I rubbed my wrists and leaned back in the chair. I knew exactly what was happening. This was an off-the-books intimidation tactic. Trent owned this precinct. He owned the men in uniform, and he owned the men in cheap suits who ran the detective division. I waited with perfect stillness. The analog clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the seconds. 10 minutes passed, then 15. They were letting me sit in silence, hoping the isolation would break my nerve and make me pliable. Finally, the door clicked open. A heavy-set man with a receding hairline and a stained yellow tie walked in. He carried a manila folder and a silver pen. He dropped the folder onto the scratched metal table with a loud smack. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down, leaning back with a wildly smug expression. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. He did not read me my Miranda rights. He did not ask if I wanted a lawyer present. He just opened the folder and slid a familiar document across the table. It was the non-disclosure agreement and the church equity transfer deed Trent had tried to force on me in the driveway 3 days ago. Detective Miller tapped the silver pen against the paper. He told me I was facing 5 years in a state penitentiary for the unauthorized practice of law and aggravated harassment. He said Trent was a reasonable and forgiving man. He said Trent was willing to drop all the charges and let me walk out the front door tonight. All I had to do was sign the paper, relinquish my minority stake in the community center, and promise to never speak about Trent or his business again. "It is a generous offer," Valerie the detective said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You already threw your life away once. Do not be stupid enough to do it again. Sign the paper and go home to your family." I did not touch the pen. I did not look at the document. I looked directly into his eyes and I remained completely silent. Detective Miller sighed. He tried the nice guy routine for another 5 minutes, explaining how a felony conviction would ruin whatever pathetic life I had left. He said my parents were already humiliated enough tonight. I said nothing. I kept my face an unreadable mask. His patience began to wear thin. He leaned across the table, raising his voice. He called me a disgraced paralegal. He said nobody would believe a woman who lost her law license for tampering with evidence. He said I was a nobody, and Trent was a king in this city. He slammed his heavy fist on the table, demanding I pick up the pen and sign my name. 20 full minutes ticked by. I let him yell. I let him threaten me with prison time, with solitary confinement, with total public ruin. I watched the vein in his forehead bulge as his frustration grew to a boiling point. He was used to suspects crying. He was used to people begging for a deal. My absolute silence was deeply unnerving him. The smug confidence he walked in with was slowly cracking under the weight of my calm stare. I was analyzing every micro-expression on his face, just as I was trained to do at Quantico. Finally, he stopped yelling. He was breathing heavily, staring at me like I was a ghost. "Are you deaf, Valerie?" he spat, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "Are you really willing to go to jail over pride?" I uncrossed my arms and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal table. I spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. My voice was low and commanding. "Where are my personal belongings, Miller?" He blinked, clearly confused by my sudden shift in tone. "They are in lockup," he said. "Why?" "Bring me my purse!" I demanded, my tone shifting from suspect to superior officer. "Do it now." He hesitated, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. But the absolute authority in my voice compelled him to obey. He stood up and left the room, returning 2 minutes later with my black leather handbag. He tossed it onto the table with a scowl. "Open it," I instructed. He frowned but unsnapped the metal clasp. "Feel the lining at the very bottom," I said. "Press your thumb against the seam on the left side." Detective Miller reached inside his thick fingers, digging into the material. He froze. He felt the rigid outline hidden beneath the fabric. "Use your pocket knife," I told him. "Cut it open." He pulled a small folding knife from his pocket and sliced the seam. He reached inside and pulled out a solid black steel card. There was no name printed on it. No photograph. Just a gold magnetic strip and an embedded microchip. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing all its arrogant edge. "Swipe it on your terminal," I said, gesturing toward the computer sitting on the small desk in the corner of the room. Miller looked at me, then looked at the heavy card. He walked over to the terminal. He slid the black steel card through the reader. The machine beeped a sharp, high-pitched sound. The screen went blank for a second. Then it flashed a brilliant warning red. Large, bold, white letters filled the monitor, illuminating the dark room. "Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General, Special Agent Valerie Thomas, Clearance Level 5, Full Federal Authority." Detective Miller stopped breathing. The silver pen slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a loud clatter. His face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray. He began to tremble violently, his eyes darting from the glowing red screen to me. The corrupt local cop realized he had just kidnapped and threatened a high-ranking federal agent working an active undercover operation. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I walked over to him, pulling the black card from the reader and slipping it into my pocket. I looked at his terrified, sweating face. "You have exactly 3 minutes to get the FBI regional director on the phone," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, terrifying whisper. "Do it before you spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth." Detective Miller stared at the glowing red screen as the color drained from his face entirely. His hands shook so violently he could barely dial the internal phone on his desk. Within 90 seconds, the precinct captain burst through the heavy metal door. The captain was a broad man who usually moved with arrogant authority, but right now he was sweating through his uniform shirt. He took one look at my federal clearance level on the monitor and swallowed hard. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I sat back down in the metal chair and crossed my legs. I told them both exactly how the rest of the night was going to play out. I explained that Trent had been under federal investigation for 2 years for laundering illicit funds through offshore shell companies. I explained that corrupt local officials who aided him would face federal racketeering charges unless they cooperated fully with my task force. The captain nodded frantically, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He promised complete cooperation. He begged for leniency, claiming he had no idea Trent was involved in federal crimes. I let him grovel for a moment before giving him his orders. "You are going to process my release immediately," I instructed, my tone flat and uncompromising. "And then you are going to call Trent. You will tell him that his intimidation tactic worked perfectly. You will tell him that the charges were dropped because he generously decided to show mercy to his unstable sister-in-law. You will make him believe he is the smartest man in the city." The captain looked confused, but he did not dare argue. He simply nodded and gestured for Miller to unlock the door. They handed my purse back to me with trembling hands, treating it like a live explosive. I adjusted my coat and walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the 2 corrupt cops suffocating in their own fear. The front desk sergeant handed me my keys and phone without making eye contact. The entire precinct was unnaturally quiet. The word had already trickled down the ranks that they had mistakenly arrested a federal agent. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the station and stepped out into the muggy Atlanta night air. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the concrete steps. Trent was waiting for me. He was leaning against the hood of his black luxury sedan, parked under the flickering light of a street lamp. He looked completely at ease, checking his expensive watch as I walked down the steps. He expected to see a broken woman. He expected to see me trembling and defeated after spending 2 hours in a windowless room with his corrupt detectives. This was the moment he lived for. He thrived on breaking people and forcing them to submit to his wealth and influence. I kept my posture slightly slouched, playing the part perfectly. I stopped a few feet away from him, letting my gaze drop to the pavement. I hugged my arms around myself as if I were cold and frightened. Trent pushed himself off the hood of his car and slowly walked toward me. His leather shoes scraped against the asphalt. He stopped right in front of me, blocking my path to the street. He let out a long, dramatic sigh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a disobedient child. "You really have no idea how lucky you are, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "I could have let them lock you in a cell tonight. I could have let them ruin whatever pathetic life you have managed to scrape together since your disbarment. I could have let you become just another statistic in the system. But your parents begged me to show mercy. They pleaded with me not to send their disgraced daughter to prison. They cried for you, Valerie." I kept my eyes on this ground. I let my shoulders drop, playing the role of the defeated scapegoat. I did not say a word. I let the silence stretch, allowing his ego to expand and fill the empty space. "Look at me when I speak to you," Trent snapped, stepping closer until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. I slowly raised my head. His pale blue eyes were filled with arrogant triumph. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed his power was absolute and that he had successfully terrified me into submission. He believed I was just a ruined paralegal who had stepped too far out of her lane. "I made a phone call and pulled some very expensive strings to get those charges dropped," he lied smoothly, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "You owe me your freedom, Valerie. You owe me your absolute submission. From now on, you will keep your mouth shut. You will smile at family dinners, and you will never question my authority again. You will sit in the background where you belong. If you ever try to interfere with my business or my charity work, I will not be so generous. The next time you leave a police station, it will be in an orange jumpsuit on a bus heading to the state penitentiary. Do you understand me?" I forced my voice to sound small and defeated. "I understand, Trent." He smiled, his perfectly white teeth gleaming in the dim streetlight. He reached out and patted my shoulder twice. It was a demeaning, patronizing gesture meant to remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. He turned away and walked back toward his car, opening the driver's side door. He paused and looked back at me over the roof of the sedan. The night air was thick and quiet, waiting for his final decree. Tomorrow morning, your parents are signing full operational control of the church and its properties over to my holding company. Trent announced, his tone casually cruel. The board members have all agreed. We are holding a special signing ceremony in the pastoral office at 10 in the morning. It will be a private family matter. You will stay home. Do not interfere. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The powerful motor purred in the quiet street. He rolled down the window, expecting me to walk away in shame. He wanted to watch me retreat into the shadows. Instead, I took one step toward his car. I looked at him through the open window. The submissive posture I had been holding vanished entirely. I stood tall and my expression settled into cold, hard granite. The mask of the terrified sister-in-law melted away, revealing the federal agent underneath. I will be there to witness it, I replied, my voice completely steady and hollow. Trent frowned, his smug expression slipping for a fraction of a second. He did not like the sudden shift in my tone. He did not like that I was not crying or begging for his forgiveness. He opened his mouth to deliver another threat, but I did not give him the chance. I turned on my heel and walked away toward my own car, leaving him sitting there in the dark. He thought he had won the war by intimidating a disgraced paralegal. He had no idea that tomorrow morning he was going to sign his own federal indictment in front of everyone he knew. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corporate law firm belonging to Trent. His office occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass skyscraper in the financial district. It was designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its heavy oak doors. I stepped off the private elevator, and my heels sank into the plush gray carpet. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I ignored her frantic protests and pushed straight through the double doors of the main conference room. The room smelled of rich mahogany and expensive espresso. Trent sat at the head of a massive conference table, looking perfectly tailored and completely in control. My father, Reverend Thomas, sat to his right, clutching a gold pen. My mother, Yvonne, sat beside him, wringing her manicured hands. Alicia lounged in a leather executive chair across from them, sipping sparkling water. Spread out on the polished wood surface was the master deed to the new community center, along with a stack of transfer documents. They were preparing to sign away the multi-million-dollar property built on the backs of church donations directly into the offshore holding company run by Trent. Everyone froze when I entered the room. The silence was thick and heavy. Trent leaned back in his chair with a slow, arrogant smirk crossing his face. My mother stood up abruptly, knocking her coffee cup against a saucer. "Valerie, what are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with anger. "Trent specifically told you to stay away. After everything he did for you last night, you still have the nerve to show your face." My father slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a deep shade of red. "You are a disgrace to this family, Valerie," he shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Trent pulled strings to keep you out of a jail cell, and this is how you repay him. You come here to cause more trouble and ruin the only good thing happening to our church." I walked further into the room, keeping my face completely blank. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I just let them hurl their toxic words. Alicia stood up and walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She crossed her arms and deliberately pulled back the sleeve of her silk blouse. Resting on her wrist was a massive new diamond watch, catching the morning light and throwing prisms across the walls. "Do you see this, Valerie?" she asked, her tone dripping with venomous pride. "Trent bought this for me this morning with the advance money from the property transfer. He is securing our future while you are busy destroying yours. You are completely delusional if you think you can stop this deal. We are protecting the family from your legal mess." My mother nodded vigorously, coming to stand beside Alicia. "Trent is saving us from the scandal you caused," she insisted, her eyes flashing with misguided self-righteousness. "By transferring the community center to his firm, we protect the assets from any lawsuits connected to your arrest. He is taking on a massive burden to clean up your mistakes." You should be down on your knees thanking him instead of standing there looking so arrogant. My father picked up the gold pen and pointed it at me. We are signing these papers right now, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it, he declared. You lost your law license. You lost your reputation. You are a nobody, Valerie. Trent let out a soft chuckle and stood up, smoothing his expensive suit jacket. He walked around the table and stood behind my parents, placing a protective hand on my father's shoulder. Let her watch Thomas, he said, his voice smooth and oily. Let her see how a real family operates. Let her witness what happens when adults make difficult decisions to protect their legacy. He looked directly at me, his pale blue eyes filled with absolute triumph. I told you last night, Valerie, you belong in the background. You are just a spectator to my success. Now stand there quietly while your father secures my control over the entire church estate. I folded my hands in front of me and gave him a slow nod. I will not stop you, I said, my voice soft and perfectly calm. I just came to witness the signing. Trent smiled broadly, thinking he had finally broken my spirit. He turned back to my parents and gestured toward the thick stack of papers. Please proceed, Reverend, he said warmly. My father leaned over the documents. He flipped to the final page of the master deed. He placed the gold pen against the paper and signed his name with a flourishing stroke. My mother quickly followed, signing on the line below his. They pushed the documents toward Trent. He picked up his own pen and signed his name at the bottom, officially transferring the multi-million-dollar property into a shell corporation designed for money laundering. He slid the master deed to the center of the mahogany table for the notary to stamp. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table. Trent watched me with amusement, thinking I was coming to mourn my defeat. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a small, flat device that looked like a sleek black phone. I leaned over the mahogany table, pretending to inspect the signatures. In one smooth, fluid motion, I passed the device directly over the master deed. A tiny green light flashed on the back of the black casing, indicating the high-resolution scan was complete. The microscanner instantly encrypted the image and uploaded the final piece of unassailable evidence directly to the federal database. The money laundering circuit was now legally documented and fully executed. I slipped the device back into my pocket and looked up at Trent. My parents were still glaring at me, but I only focused on the corrupt man standing at the head of the table. I smiled. It was the same dead, terrifying smile I had given him outside the police station. The trap was locked. I turned my back on the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room and walked down the long executive corridor. The thick gray carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps, leaving the hallway in absolute silence. I pushed open the frosted glass door of the women's restroom and stepped inside. The space was designed to reflect the massive wealth of Trent and his corrupt law firm. Floor-to-ceiling marble covered the walls, and gold fixtures gleamed under the soft, recessed lighting. I walked over to the nearest sink and turned on the cold water. I held my hands under the stream, letting the freezing water run over my wrists, where the heavy steel handcuffs had dug into my skin the night before. I stared at my reflection in the wide mirror. My face was calm and completely unreadable. The operation was entering its final phase, and I needed to remain perfectly composed. The heavy restroom door suddenly swung open with a violent thud, hitting the marble wall tile. Alicia marched inside, clicking her high heels aggressively against the stone floor. She turned around and flipped the brass deadbolt, locking us inside. Her face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the fake, sweet demeanor she always wore in front of our parents had vanished entirely. She looked frantic and dangerous, like a cornered animal, realizing the trap was closing in. She dropped her designer handbag onto the marble counter with a loud clatter and started rummaging inside. She pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a gold pen. She slapped the checkbook onto the counter next to the sinks and started writing frantically. The pen scratched loudly against the paper in the quiet room. She ripped the check from the binding and stepped into my personal space, shoving the piece of paper directly against my chest. She forced me to take it. I looked down at the paper. It was written out for $20,000. "Take this and move to another state," she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. "Pack whatever you have left and get out of Atlanta today." I did not react. I simply held the check in my hand and looked at her perfectly painted face. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. "You really do not understand what Trent is capable of, Valerie," she continued, her tone dripping with venom. "He will absolutely crush you. You think you are so smart showing up here today and acting like you are not completely terrified, but you are just playing a game you cannot possibly win. He is a king in this city, and he is going to ruin you all over again. And if you stay here, I will personally help him do it. You know exactly what I did to you 5 years ago, and I will gladly do it again." I looked at my sister, studying the hatred in her eyes. I had suspected the truth for a very long time. My task force had uncovered anomalies in the old case files during our background investigation. But I needed her to say it. I needed her to say the words out loud to finally confirm the ultimate family betrayal that had destroyed my early 20s. "What exactly did you do, Alicia?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady, echoing slightly against the bathroom tile. She let out a short, bitter laugh. She stepped even closer to me until I could smell her expensive floral perfume mixed with the sour scent of her nervous sweat. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to break me down and make me feel small. "I did what I had to do to survive," she whispered harshly, leaning into my face. "The firm was looking for a scapegoat for that missing settlement money. I was a junior associate just like you, and my entire career was on the line. I knew you had the master file access. I knew you trusted me enough to leave your terminal unlocked when you went to lunch. So I altered the documents myself. I changed the transfer dates to match your login times, and I forged your digital signature on the authorization forms." She did not look guilty at all. She looked intensely proud of her deception. She smiled a cruel, twisted smile. "And when the state investigators came asking questions, I sat in that deposition chair and I swore under oath that I saw you take those physical files," she boasted. "I committed perjury and evidence tampering to save my own career, and I let you take the absolute fall. You lost your law license and your reputation because you were weak and trusting. I survived because I am willing to do whatever it takes to win. That is the difference between us, Valerie. I am a winner, and you are just collateral damage." Hearing the words spoken out loud sent a cold wave of realization through my body. My own flesh and blood had systematically framed me for a felony to save her own skin. She had watched me lose my career and face public humiliation while she climbed the corporate ladder and married the senior partner. She watched me, expecting me to cry. She expected me to break down and scream at her. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of her superiority. She pointed a manicured finger at the check in my hand. "That money is the only mercy you are ever going to get from me," she sneered. "Cash it and disappear forever. If you show your face near my husband or my new church ever again, I will fabricate new evidence so fast your head will spin. You will go to state prison this time, and Mom and Dad will stand right beside me and applaud while they lock you away." I looked down at the piece of paper in my hand. $20,000 to forget a lifetime of abuse and betrayal. $20,000 to walk away and let them run their criminal empire through our childhood sanctuary. I ran my thumb over her frantic signature. I did not raise my hand to strike her. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic energy. I just held her gaze with cold, unwavering certainty. I slowly brought my hands together and ripped the check precisely down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet bathroom. Alicia gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock. I put the pieces together and tore them again and again until the check was nothing but tiny, jagged shreds of paper. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter down into the pristine white porcelain sink. I turned on the gold faucet and watched the cold water soak the paper, washing the shredded pieces down the drain. Alicia stared at the sink, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend what I had just done. She had expected total submission. She had expected fear and compliance. I turned off the water and looked at my sister one final time. The micro scanner in my pocket had already transmitted the signed deed to my field office. The tactical assault teams were already gearing up in the staging area. The entire corrupt world Alicia had built for herself was about to collapse into dust. "Keep your money, Alicia," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "You are going to need it for commissary." I walked out of the polished marble restroom without looking back. I left Alicia standing frozen near the sinks, staring down at the soggy, torn pieces of her worthless check. My heavy boots made no sound against the thick gray carpet of the executive corridor as I headed for the exit. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The brass doors slid shut, cutting off the stifling air of the corrupt law firm. I touched the fabric of my coat pocket, feeling the solid, cold weight of the microscanner. The encrypted data packet containing the master deed and the fraudulent signatures was already flying through secure federal servers. The final piece of the money laundering puzzle was locked safely in our database. I walked out of the glass skyscraper and blended into the busy morning crowds on the downtown streets. I knew exactly what was happening in the penthouse above me. Alicia was rushing back into the conference room with her perfectly painted face pale and terrified. She was whispering to Trent that the bribe had failed. She was telling him that I was not running away and that his absolute control was slipping. Trent was a man who demanded total obedience from his environment and his family. The realization that I was not intimidated by his corrupt police officers or his wealthy wife would send him into a blind, narcissistic rage. He expected me to cower and flee to another state. When I did not, he would immediately resort to his favorite weapon, which was the legal system. I spent the rest of the day in my secure safe house, watching the digital surveillance feeds our technical team had established inside his network. I watched Trent pace back and forth behind his massive mahogany desk. I watched him bark angry orders at his junior partners and paralegals. He was furious that a disgraced family member was openly defying him. He decided to crush me so completely that I would never be able to stand up again. He drafted an emergency motion to be filed in the district court. He filed for a permanent protective order and demanded massive financial sanctions against me, claiming I was a violent threat. The legal documents were a masterclass in fiction and defamation. He claimed I was a deeply unstable and dangerous individual suffering from severe delusions. He stated I was obsessed with ruining his philanthropic efforts and destroying his family out of petty jealousy. He requested an immediate injunction to freeze my bank accounts and bar me from coming within 500 feet of him or my parents or the newly acquired community center. He even had my parents sign sworn affidavits supporting his lies. But Trent did not just file the motion and wait for the standard docket assignment. He was far too controlling to leave my destruction to a random judge. He pulled his most valuable string and specifically requested that the emergency hearing be assigned to Judge Wallace. Judge Wallace was not just a magistrate in the district court. He was the judicial cornerstone of the entire criminal enterprise. He was the man who authorized the transfer of the stolen settlement funds 5 years ago. He was the man who looked down at me from his elevated bench and signed the order that destroyed my career based on the perjured testimony Alicia had provided. I still remembered the sound of his heavy wooden gavel striking the block as he declared me unfit to practice law. Wallace had been taking a cut of the laundered money for years, ensuring that Trent never faced any legal consequences for his offshore accounts or his predatory real estate acquisitions. Trent specifically requested Wallace because he knew the corrupt judge would rubber stamp my absolute ruin without a single question. He expected Wallace to sign the permanent restraining order and issue sanctions so heavy I would be paying them off for the rest of my life. They thought they were setting a brilliant legal trap to bury me forever. They did not realize they were voluntarily walking into a federal net that had been woven specifically for them. By requesting Wallace to preside over the hearing, Trent was bringing all the key players into one room. He was gathering the corrupt lawyer, the complicit family members, and the dirty judge into a single enclosed space. It was exactly what my task force had been hoping he would do. The arrogance of powerful men was always their greatest vulnerability. They believed their wealth and influence made them untouchable. They believed the rules did not apply to them. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the sparse living room of my safe house. I sat on the edge of the sofa drinking black coffee and reviewing the tactical deployment plans. My laptop screen glowed with the faces of the tactical assault teams who would be waiting in the underground parking garage of the courthouse tomorrow morning. Every federal agent was fully briefed on the operation. Everything was perfectly aligned. The heavy knock on my apartment door broke the silence of the room. I set my coffee mug down and walked to the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a bored-looking man holding a thick stack of manila folders. It was the process server Trent had hired to deliver the emergency court summons. I opened the door and accepted the heavy stack of legal documents without a word. The server turned and walked away down the dim hallway. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt leaning against the wood as I flipped through the pages. The summons ordered me to appear in the district courtroom of Judge Wallace at 9 in the morning. The language in the filing was aggressive and vindictive. It demanded that I surrender my passport and submit to a psychological evaluation. Trent was trying to paint me as a deranged stalker to justify taking total control of the church properties and silencing me permanently. I tossed the thick stack of papers onto the coffee table. They were nothing but expensive kindling now. My federal badge sat right next to them, gleaming in the low light. My secure encrypted cell phone began to vibrate on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed a scrambled string of numbers. I picked it up and pressed the green button to accept the call. It was my FBI handler speaking from the regional command center downtown. He had been monitoring the court filings as they hit the digital docket. His voice was sharp and crackling with pure anticipation over the encrypted line. "Agent, the trap is set," my handler said over the secure line, his words echoing in the quiet apartment. "The judge, the lawyer, and the shell companies are all lined up. Take them down." "I will see you at the courthouse," I replied, and ended the call. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy gray sky pouring rain over the city streets. I walked through the towering marble columns of the district courthouse, feeling the weight of the building pressing down on me. I bypassed the standard metal detectors using my federal credentials, flashing my badge discreetly to the security guards. I took the grand staircase to the third floor, where the most critical phase of the entire undercover operation was about to unfold. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 stood wide open. I stepped inside and immediately felt the hostile energy radiating from the wooden benches. The gallery was packed, completely full of people from my past. Trent had clearly mobilized his entire network to witness my final destruction and humiliate me publicly. The pews were filled with prominent church elders, wealthy donors, and senior members of his law firm. They all turned their heads in unison to watch me walk down the center aisle. Trent sat at the plaintiff table, looking absolutely regal in a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair with his arms draped casually over the armrests, projecting absolute power and untouchable arrogance. He had 3 junior partners sitting directly behind him, shuffling thick stacks of legal documents and whispering nervously among themselves. He was putting on a massive theatrical display of dominance to prove to the entire room that he was the undisputed king of this city. I walked past the polished wooden divider and approached the defense podium. I stood there completely alone. I brought no briefcase, no legal pads, and absolutely no defense attorney to speak on my behalf. A harsh murmur rippled through the gallery behind me. I could hear their cruel whispers judging me for showing up to a high-stakes legal battle with empty hands and no defense strategy. I turned my head slightly to look at the front row of the gallery. My parents sat directly behind Trent, positioned proudly in the seat of honor. My father glared at me with absolute disgust, his jaw locked tight in furious condemnation. My mother refused to even make eye contact, staring pointedly at the polished wooden table in front of Trent. They had chosen their side, firmly aligning their faith and their entire family legacy with a ruthless criminal. Alicia sat right next to them, wearing a bright red designer dress that screamed for attention. She caught my eye and smiled a cold, vicious smile. She slowly mouthed the word loser, making sure I saw the exaggerated movement of her lips. She was practically vibrating with excitement, waiting for the judge to strip away my freedom and finalize her absolute victory over my life. I turned back around and faced the empty judicial bench. My microscopic earpiece was hidden deeply inside my right ear canal, providing a direct, secure line to the tactical command unit waiting in the basement. My handler breathed softly over the comms, confirming the perimeter was fully secured and the strike teams were in position. The building was completely locked down, and none of the targets sitting in the room had any idea they were surrounded by federal agents. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open with a loud creak. The bailiff stepped forward and shouted for everyone to rise. The entire courtroom stood up in unison, the sound of rustling clothing and shifting wood echoing against the high vaulted ceiling. The bailiff announced the Honorable Judge Wallace to the court, his voice booming through the tense and silent room. Judge Wallace walked up the short steps and took his seat behind the elevated mahogany bench. He was an older man with a sharp, weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He arranged his heavy black robes and looked down at the thick legal docket resting in front of him. He slowly lifted his head, and his gaze locked directly onto me. He glared down at me from his seat of ultimate authority, his expression radiating pure, unadulterated contempt. He clearly remembered destroying my career 5 years ago, and he was completely prepared to execute the aggressive orders Trent had requested in the emergency motion. He thought I was just a helpless, desperate victim walking blindly into his judicial slaughterhouse. The trap was now fully populated, and the most corrupt man in the room had just picked up his gavel. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel echoed through the cavernous marble courtroom, silencing the hostile whispers of the gallery behind me. Judge Wallace leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on me with unwavering disdain. He did not bother with the standard legal formalities or the customary reading of the docket. He simply nodded toward the plaintiff table and invited Trent to present his emergency motion, allowing him to bypass every standard procedural rule in the book. Trent stood up slowly and deliberately, buttoning his custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket. He walked out from behind the heavy oak table and moved to the open space in the center of the room. He did not look like a normal lawyer presenting a civil case. He looked like a king addressing his loyal subjects from a throne. He began his speech with a soft, practiced sigh of deep regret. He told the court that he stood before them not just as a prominent attorney, but as a desperate family man trying to protect his vulnerable loved ones from a dangerous and highly unstable threat. For the next 15 minutes, Trent delivered the most brutal and calculated character assassination I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He paced gracefully across the polished floor, painting me as a bitter, vengeful woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. He brought up my disbarment from 5 years ago, holding it up to the light as absolute proof of my inherent criminality. He told the judge that I was a proven fraud and a manipulative thief who had betrayed my own law firm and brought endless shame upon my deeply religious family. He claimed that losing my prestigious law license had driven me insane with uncontrollable jealousy. Trent gestured dramatically toward the front row of the gallery where my parents and Alicia were sitting shoulder to shoulder. He spoke at length about the supposed emotional torture I had inflicted upon my younger sister over the years. He painted Alicia as a fragile saint who had tried everything in her power to help her troubled older sibling, only to be met with my malicious and violent obsession. He claimed I was relentlessly jealous of Alicia because she had the perfect marriage, the perfect life, and the unblemished reputation that I had foolishly squandered. As he spun these elaborate and sickening lies, my mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. My father nodded solemnly, his face a rigid mask of righteous sorrow and disappointment. Alicia simply looked down at her lap, pretending to be a terrified victim, while secretly relishing every single word of my public humiliation. I saw her shoulders shake slightly, holding back a laugh. Trent then shifted his focus to the church elders sitting densely packed in the wooden pews. He raised his voice, letting it echo off the high vaulted ceilings as he described my mere presence as a toxic infection threatening their entire community. He claimed I was actively trying to sabotage the new community center project out of pure spite because I had been rightfully cast out of their holy circle. He painted himself as the noble savior, bravely stepping into the line of fire to shield the congregation from my destructive vendetta. The elders murmured their agreement, completely blinded by his charismatic deception. I stood alone at the defense podium with my hands resting lightly on the cold, polished wood. I did not interrupt his theatrical performance. I did not object to his blatant lies. I simply listened to the steady breathing of my FBI handler through the microscopic earpiece hidden deep inside my ear canal. My handler confirmed that every single word Trent spoke was being recorded and transmitted directly to the Federal Command Center downtown. Trent was voluntarily providing us with a flawless audio recording of his own perjury and witness manipulation in an open court of law. He thought he was burying me, but he was actually digging his own federal prison cell deeper with every arrogant syllable. Reaching the climax of his monologue, Trent turned his attention back to the elevated bench. He demanded that the court issue a permanent and irrevocable restraining order, barring me from ever coming near his law firm, his family, or any property associated with the church estate. But a simple restraining order was not enough to satisfy his massive ego. Trent wanted to ensure I could never fight back or threaten his hidden offshore shell companies again. He formally requested that the court impose devastating financial sanctions against me for filing frivolous legal challenges and causing his family severe emotional distress. He looked me dead in the eyes and demanded $500,000 in immediate penalties. Trent knew my fabricated financial history. He knew that a sudden sanction of $500,000 would instantly bankrupt a normal citizen. His ultimate goal was to force me into absolute poverty, to freeze my bank accounts, and to leave me completely destitute on the streets. He wanted me broken, homeless, and terrified of ever speaking his name again. He finished his speech by stating that I was a menace to society, who needed to be locked away and heavily medicated for the safety of everyone in the room. The courtroom was dead silent, as Trent bowed his head slightly toward the judge and walked back to his leather chair. He sat down and smoothed his expensive silk tie, shooting a victorious smirk toward my parents. Judge Wallace did not ask Trent for a single shred of documentary evidence to support these massive claims. He did not ask for sworn police reports or psychiatric medical evaluations. The corrupt judge simply nodded his head in complete agreement, clearly prepared to rubber stamp my absolute destruction exactly as they had planned in their backroom dealings. The heavy rain beat steadily against the tall glass windows of the courtroom, matching the dark tension inside the room. Judge Wallace shifted his heavy black robes and looked down at me from his high bench. His eyes were cold and filled with impatient malice. He clearly expected me to be sobbing uncontrollably or begging the court for mercy. Instead, he saw a woman standing perfectly still, her expression completely detached and unafraid. The judge leaned forward and spoke into his microphone, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Miss," he said sharply, "do you have any defense against these severe allegations, or are we done here?" My handler spoke softly in my ear, telling me the strike teams were ready to breach the heavy oak doors on my mark. "Agent, the trap is set," my handler said, his voice crystal clear over the secure frequency. "The judge, the lawyer, and the shell companies are all lined up. Take them down." I looked directly into the corrupt eyes of the judge and finally broke my silence. "I have one file for your honor to review." Trent slammed his hand down on the polished mahogany table before the last word even left my mouth. "Your Honor, I object to this pathetic theatrical display." He barked, his voice echoing violently off the cold marble walls of the cavernous courtroom. "This is nothing but a desperate stall tactic from a deeply disturbed woman who has absolutely no respect for the legal process or the sanctity of your courtroom." He paced aggressively behind his plaintiff table, gesturing wildly toward me, as if I were a dangerous wild animal that needed to be restrained immediately. "She has no legal counsel. She submitted no preliminary evidence during the discovery phase, and she has absolutely no standing to present random, unverified documents at an emergency hearing. This is exactly the kind of erratic and unpredictable behavior I detailed in my motion." She is wasting the court's valuable time and making a massive mockery of our entire justice system. I did not flinch or react to his explosive anger. I did not turn my head to acknowledge his furious outburst. The packed gallery behind me erupted into a low, buzzing hum of hostile whispers. I could feel the burning, judgmental glares of my mother and father boring directly into my back. They were completely captivated by Trent's masterful performance, believing every single lie he spun about my character. Alicia let out a sharp theatrical gasp of exaggerated disbelief, covering her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand to emphasize her fake distress to the people sitting around her. She leaned over and whispered something vicious into my mother's ear, causing my mother to shake her head in profound disappointment. I calmly reached into the deep pocket of my heavy, dark wool coat. My movements were deliberately slow and incredibly precise, meant to project absolute control in the face of their manufactured chaos. I pulled out a thick, heavy, unmarked brown envelope. There were no return addresses on the outside, no formal legal headers, and absolutely no identifying marks. It was just a raw, dense package of absolute destruction. I held it out silently toward the armed bailiff, who was standing near the empty witness stand. Trent let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly forced and laced with sudden desperation. He leaned heavily against his table, pointing a mocking finger at the simple brown package resting in my outstretched hand. "What exactly is that, Valerie?" He sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom and condescension. "A printout of Wikipedia laws. Did you stay up all night finding some sovereign citizen loophole on the internet to save yourself?" He turned to face the crowded gallery, making sure my parents, the wealthy donors, and the church elders could fully appreciate his cruel joke. "She has been completely out of the legal profession for 5 years, Your Honor." Trent continued, his voice carrying a dark, mocking theatricality. "She was permanently disbarred for severe ethical violations and massive financial fraud. She has clearly forgotten how a real court of law operates. She actually thinks she can just walk in here with a mysterious piece of junk mail and overturn a formal injunction that is designed to protect innocent people from her violent instability." He was trying so incredibly hard to maintain his cultivated image as the untouchable king of the city. But the frantic, panicked edge in his voice betrayed his deeply hidden anxiety. A man with nothing to hide does not panic over a single closed envelope. He knew I was highly intelligent. He knew I used to be one of the absolute best junior associates at his prestigious firm before Alicia conspired to frame me. The sheer physical weight of the envelope in my hand was more than enough to trigger his deeply buried paranoia. I ignored his desperate taunts entirely. My posture remained perfectly straight, my shoulders relaxed, my breathing incredibly steady and measured. My eyes were locked dead onto Judge Wallace. I did not blink a single time. I channeled every ounce of my federal task force training into that single unwavering stare. I needed the corrupt judge to feel the immense crushing pressure of my gaze. I needed him to understand on a primal level that this was not a desperate plea from a broken woman, but a calculated tactical strike from a highly trained federal operative. The armed bailiff hesitated, looking up at the elevated bench for permission to approach. The heavy silence in the room suddenly became entirely suffocating. The hostile whispers from the church elders instantly died down as the tension stretched to an absolute breaking point. Even Trent stopped his aggressive pacing, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as the complete chilling stillness of my demeanor began to genuinely unnerve him. He opened his mouth to launch another loud objection, but Judge Wallace raised a single weathered hand demanding absolute silence in his courtroom. The judge narrowed his cold, dark eyes at me. He was trying to read my expression, trying to find any tiny trace of fear, hesitation, or mental instability. He found absolutely nothing but cold federal justice staring back at him. The air conditioning system hummed quietly above us, becoming the only sound in the massive cavernous room. "Very well, Miss Valerie," the judge said, his voice low and gravelly echoing through the microphone. "Let us see what you consider to be a valid defense against these incredibly serious allegations." He nodded sharply at the bailiff, granting him permission to move. The bailiff stepped forward, his heavy black boots thudding rhythmically against the polished wooden floorboards. He reached out and took the thick brown envelope from my hand. The package felt incredibly heavy because it contained hundreds of pages of encrypted bank transfers, offshore account routing numbers, and direct authorized transcripts of the federal wiretaps we had been running on Trent's law firm for months. It was the breathtaking culmination of a massive undercover investigation compressed into a single unpretentious brown wrapper. I watched the bailiff walk slowly across the wide well of the court. Every single eye in the room followed his measured movements. Trent gripped the edge of his mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white from the intense pressure. Alicia leaned forward in her seat in the front row, her new diamond watch catching the dull gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. My parents held their breath, fully expecting the judge to throw the envelope back in my face and order my immediate arrest for contempt of court. The bailiff climbed the short wooden steps and approached the elevated mahogany bench. He extended his arm and handed the heavy, unmarked brown envelope directly to Judge Wallace. The judge took it with a look of deep, profound annoyance, fully expecting to find the rambling, illegible manifestos of a desperate and broken woman. He picked up a sleek silver letter opener from his cluttered desk. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Wallace slid the sharp metal blade under the heavy paper flap and broke the seal. The sharp, tearing sound of the thick paper echoed loudly over the absolute silence of the room. Judge Wallace reached inside the torn opening of the brown envelope and pulled out the thick stack of documents. He adjusted his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose, preparing to quickly scan and dismiss whatever amateur legal defense he thought I had cobbled together. His lips were already curled into a dismissive sneer as his eyes met the first page. But the document in his hands was not a printout of Wikipedia laws or a desperate handwritten plea for mercy. It was 50 pages of premium heavy cardstock bound with a secure federal seal. Judge Wallace stared at the top of the first page, and his breathing suddenly stopped. Printed in bold black ink across the top margin was the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Right below the seal were the unmistakable words, "Federal indictment outlining massive charges of judicial corruption, money laundering, and wire fraud." His dark eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of the document began to register in his brain. He was not looking at a defense motion filed by a disgraced former lawyer. He was looking at his own impending federal prison sentence. He frantically flipped to the second page, his thumb slipping clumsily against the smooth paper. His eyes darted across the glossy, high-resolution satellite photographs attached to the primary affidavit. The images were crystal clear, capturing him and Trent, meeting in the dimly lit parking garage of an abandoned shopping mall on the outskirts of the city. The timestamps printed in the bottom corner of the photos matched the exact dates when the stolen settlement funds had been secretly transferred through his courtroom. There were photos of Trent handing over thick leather briefcases and photos of Wallace walking away with them. The surveillance had been absolute and completely undetected. Wallace swallowed hard, his throat completely dry as he turned to the next section of the indictment. He found page after page of verbatim wiretap transcripts. He read the exact words he had spoken to Trent over what they both believed were untraceable burner phones. He read his own voice demanding a higher percentage of the community center buyout and explicitly promising to rubber stamp the emergency injunction against me in return. Every single corrupt negotiation, every threat, and every illegal promise had been recorded, transcribed, and legally verified by federal agents. The final devastating blow came on page 42. The judge stared at a detailed financial schematic mapping out a complex web of international money laundering. Printed in stark black numbers were the exact routing sequences for a series of highly secure, hidden bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were accounts that Wallace had spent thousands of dollars and years of careful planning to conceal behind layers of anonymous shell companies. But there they were, completely exposed on the page, perfectly matching the deposits of the stolen church funds. The FBI had not just found the money, they had traced every single stolen dollar directly back to his personal offshore vault. The transformation of the judge was immediate and entirely physical. The arrogant posture of the powerful magistrate vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but a terrified and broken old man. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of ghost white. Beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead and upper lip, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting above the bench. His hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy stack of federal documents rattled loudly against the polished wood of his desk. Down on the floor of the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to deep confusion. Trent stood up slowly from his plaintiff table, leaning forward trying to get a better look at what the judge was holding. His confident smirk had entirely melted away, replaced by a creeping sense of paranoid dread. He could see the physical collapse of his most valuable judicial asset happening right in front of his eyes, but he had no idea why. Alicia stopped her cruel whispering and sat up straight, her perfectly painted face tightening with sudden worry. My parents exchanged bewildered glances, completely unable to understand why the judge was not slamming his gavel down and declaring my immediate arrest. I stood perfectly still at the defense podium, keeping my hands resting lightly on the wood. I did not smile, and I did not break my eye contact with the bench. I simply watched the corrupt judge process the absolute destruction of his entire life. The tactical assault teams were already moving out of the basement stairwells, stepping silently into the corridors surrounding courtroom 4. The net was fully drawn, and Judge Wallace was the first one to realize he was trapped inside it. The silver letter opener slipped from his violently shaking fingers and clattered loudly against the desktop. Judge Wallace let out a ragged, gasping breath that carried clearly through the sensitive microphone in front of him. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely seized up, producing nothing but a dry clicking sound. His eyes darted wildly around the packed courtroom, looking at the doors, the windows, and the gallery, as if searching for some impossible avenue of escape. He looked down at me one last time and saw the cold, calculated reality of a federal sting operation staring back at him. Without a single word of explanation, Judge Wallace abruptly pushed his heavy leather chair back. The sudden violent movement caused his wooden gavel to roll off the edge of the elevated bench and hit the floor with a heavy thud. He grabbed the thick federal indictment, clutching it desperately to his chest like a shield. He turned his back on the entire courtroom and practically ran toward the heavy oak door leading to his private chambers. His black judicial robes billowed out behind him as he stumbled up the short steps. He threw the door open, launched himself into the private corridor, and slammed the door shut behind him with a massive echoing crack that shook the walls. For 2 seconds, the courtroom remained frozen in a state of absolute stunned silence. No one could comprehend what they had just witnessed. The presiding judge had just fled his own courtroom in the middle of a high-stakes emergency hearing without issuing a single ruling or even calling for a recess. Then the panic ensued. The packed gallery erupted into a deafening roar of shouting voices and chaotic movement. The church elders jumped to their feet, demanding answers and pointing furiously at the empty bench. Wealthy donors began pulling out their cell phones frantically, trying to call their own private attorneys. Trent slammed his fist down on his table, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He screamed at his junior partners, demanding to know what was in the envelope and why the judge had abandoned them. Alicia grabbed my mother's arm, looking around the chaotic room with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that her perfect life was violently spinning out of control. The impenetrable fortress of Trent's corrupt empire was collapsing from the inside out, and the federal agents were only seconds away from walking through the doors. The chaos in the courtroom continued to escalate into a deafening roar of panicked voices and shuffling feet. Trent stood frozen at the plaintiff table for only a fraction of a second before his legendary temper completely took over. He could not comprehend how a meticulously planned legal ambush had just evaporated right in front of his eyes. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and the veins in his neck were visibly bulging against the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He violently shoved his heavy leather chair out of the way, letting it crash loudly into the wooden divider behind him. He ignored the frantic, desperate questions coming from his junior partners. He completely ignored Alicia, who was reaching out to grab his sleeve with trembling hands. He ripped his arm away from her without even looking back. His mind was entirely consumed by a blinding, arrogant rage. He stomped toward the elevated bench, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. He marched right up the short set of wooden steps, completely bypassing the stunned bailiff who was still trying to process the sudden departure of the magistrate. Trent shoved his shoulder heavily against the thick oak door that led directly into the private judicial corridor. He did not knock or announce his presence. He simply barged into the restricted area with the entitled fury of a man who firmly believed that he owned the entire building and everyone working inside it. The private chambers of Judge Wallace were normally a sanctuary of quiet luxury and intimidating silence. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes and decorated with dark mahogany furniture. But as Trent burst through the double doors, the atmosphere inside the office was one of absolute frantic terror. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, casting long, dark shadows across the expensive Persian rug. The only sound in the room was the loud, aggressive grinding noise of a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder working at maximum capacity. Judge Wallace had completely abandoned his dignified judicial composure. His heavy black robes were carelessly discarded on the floor near his desk, looking like a deflated shadow. He was standing in the corner of the room wearing only his wrinkled white dress shirt and suspenders. His hands were moving with a frantic, jerky desperation as he pulled thick stacks of manila folders from his filing cabinets. He was frantically shoving piles of documents into the grinding teeth of the shredder, not even bothering to remove the metal paper clips or heavy staples. The machine was groaning and whining under the intense pressure, spitting out ribbons of destroyed evidence into a rapidly filling plastic bin. Trent stood in the doorway for a moment, completely bewildered by the pathetic scene unfolding in front of him. His initial rage was momentarily replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. He took a step forward into the room and slammed his hand against the solid wooden doorframe. "What the hell are you doing?" Wallace Trent barked, his voice laced with venom and arrogant authority. "Get back out there right now and finish the hearing. You are supposed to grant the permanent injunction and issue the financial sanctions. You cannot just walk off the bench when I am in the middle of crushing that pathetic woman." Judge Wallace did not stop his frantic shredding. He grabbed another armful of sensitive banking records and jammed them into the machine, his hands shaking so violently that several pages fluttered to the floor. Trent took another aggressive step forward, his patience completely exhausted. He pointed a demanding finger at the older man. "I am talking to you," Trent yelled. "We had a deal. You signed the order destroying her life and transferring the church estate assets, and your offshore accounts get another massive deposit by midnight. Stop playing games and get back on the bench before you ruin the entire operation." The word operation finally made the judge snap. He dropped the remaining folders, causing them to spill open across his expensive rug. He spun around to face Trent, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. His chest was heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. The arrogant, corrupt magistrate looked like a trapped animal desperately searching for a way to survive a sinking ship. He raised a trembling hand and pointed it directly at Trent's chest. "You absolute arrogant idiot!" Wallace screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror and unrestrained hysteria. "You have absolutely no idea what you have done. You thought you were setting a brilliant trap to bury a helpless relative. You thought you were so incredibly smart manipulating the docket to bring her into my courtroom." Trent scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, completely refusing to accept the reality of the situation. "She is a disbarred paralegal, Wallace," he sneered. "She is a broke, desperate loser who is jealous of her sister. Just sign the damn papers so we can finalize the asset transfer and be done with her forever." The judge let out a sound that was halfway between a hysterical laugh and a desperate sob. He took a step toward Trent, his face completely pale and slick with cold sweat. He grabbed the lapels of Trent's expensive suit jacket with both hands, shaking the younger lawyer with surprising desperate strength. "She is not a disbarred paralegal!" Wallace screamed, spit flying from his lips. The documents in that envelope were not a legal defense. It was a 50-page federal indictment stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice. Trent tried to push the judge away, but the older man held on tight, his grip fueled by pure panic. "The indictment has everything," Wallace continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "It has satellite photos of us meeting in the parking garage. It has verbatim transcripts of our burner phone conversations. They have the exact routing numbers for every single Cayman Island account. They tracked every dollar you laundered through my court." Trent stopped struggling. His arms slowly dropped to his sides. The deep, arrogant redness in his face instantly drained away, leaving him looking like a pale ghost. His mind scrambled desperately, trying to process the impossible information. "She is not a bitter sister," Wallace hissed, his eyes wide with absolute doom. "She is an undercover operative for the federal office of the Inspector General. You brought a federal agent directly into my courtroom, and you just confessed to witness tampering, perjury, and extortion on a recorded federal wire." Trent froze completely. The air was suddenly sucked out of the room. The heavy grinding sound of the paper shredder seemed to fade into the background as the devastating reality finally crashed down upon him. The 15-minute monologue he had just delivered in the courtroom was not a victorious victory speech. It was a complete voluntary confession to a federal task force. Every single lie he told, every threat he made, and every demand for fraudulent financial sanctions had just been captured as irrefutable evidence. He felt a cold, creeping dread crawl up his spine. The untouchable empire he had built on bribery, manipulation, and fear was already gone. The money, the status, the church properties, the law firm, all of it was completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. He was no longer the powerful king of the city. He was just another target in a massive federal sting operation. Trent slowly let go of the breath he had been holding. He turned around with agonizing slowness, the heavy polished leather of his shoes dragging against the carpet. He looked toward the open double doors of the private chambers. I was standing there leaning casually against the solid mahogany doorframe. My arms were crossed over my chest, and my federal badge was now visibly clipped to the belt of my dark trousers, gleaming under the warm office lights. I looked right into his terrified eyes and offered him a slow, cold smile. Trent stared at the federal badge clipped to my belt, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. His eyes darted from the shiny metal shield to my face and back again, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of his reality. The untouchable king of the city, the man who had spent his entire life crushing vulnerable people under the heel of his expensive Italian shoes, suddenly found himself staring into an endless dark abyss. His legs gave out completely under the crushing weight of his sudden, terrifying realization. He did not just stumble or trip. He simply collapsed, dropping heavily to his knees right in the middle of Judge Wallace's plush Persian rug. The shredded pieces of his corrupt empire fluttered around him like dirty snow, settling on his perfectly tailored trousers and the polished floorboards. The transformation was incredibly pathetic to witness. All of his carefully cultivated arrogance, all of his deeply ingrained racist superiority, and all of his condescending bravado vanished in the span of a single ragged breath. He was no longer the powerful mahogany desk lawyer who dictated the fate of entire neighborhoods with the stroke of a pen. He was a terrified, broken man wearing a suit that suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his rapidly deflating ego. The realization that I had been playing him for years, that every silent moment and every assumed weakness was actually a calculated federal trap, broke his mind completely. Tears immediately welled up in his widened eyes, spilling over his pale cheeks and dripping down onto his expensive silk tie. He looked up at me from the floor, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them out in front of him. "Valerie, please," he gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine that echoed off the leather-bound legal books lining the chamber walls. "I can fix this. I swear to God, I can fix everything right now. I will call the bank and stop the wire transfers immediately. I will sign the community center deed back over to your people this very second without any conditions. You do not need to do this to me. Just put the badge away, and we can walk out of here, and nobody ever has to know what happened in this room. I will disappear, and you can have whatever you want. He was hyperventilating now, desperately gasping for air, as the panic consumed his entire nervous system. I have millions, Valerie, he pleaded desperately, his voice rising in pitch as he scrambled for anything that might save him. Millions of dollars sitting in clean, untraceable offshore accounts. I will give you half of everything I have. I will give you the entire firm. I will give you every single asset I own. Just please do not take my life away. I will do whatever you want. I will testify against him. Trent yelled, suddenly pointing a shaking finger at Judge Wallace, who was still cowering in the corner of the room. I will tell the feds everything about his laundering schemes. I will wear a wire and give you every corrupt judge in the entire state. Just let me go. Judge Wallace let out a horrified squeak, dropping the remaining UN shredding documents onto the floor. You backstabbing little rat, Wallace stammered, his face turning purple with fresh outrage and sheer terror. You were the one who orchestrated the entire buyout. You brought the stolen church funds into my courtroom. You cannot pin this entire federal conspiracy on me. The two corrupt men stared at each other, their criminal alliance instantly dissolving into a disgusting display of desperate self-preservation. They were both completely willing to throw each other to the wolves if it meant saving their own skin. Trent completely ignored the furious judge, dragging himself forward on his knees, inching across the thick carpet toward where I stood in the doorway. He reached out with trembling, sweat-slicked hands, as if he wanted to grab the hem of my dark wool coat. But he stopped just short, too absolutely terrified of what I might do to him if he actually made physical contact. He was completely unhinged, spit flying from his trembling lips, as he frantically tried to buy his way out of a guaranteed federal prison sentence. He knew the conviction rate for federal office of the Inspector General cases, and he knew his life as a free man was officially over. I will leave the city today, Trent begged, his face red and slick with cold sweat and tears. I will resign from the firm and give up my law license, and you will never ever have to see me again. Just please, Valerie, please have some mercy on me. We are family. You have to remember that we are family. Think of Alicia. She is your own sister and she loves you so much. You cannot do this to your own sister. You cannot send her husband to a maximum security federal penitentiary and ruin her perfect life. Please, Val. We are family. Think of Alicia. He sobbed heavily, burying his face in his trembling hands and weeping like a terrified child. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping mess of a man kneeling at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. I channeled every memory of the innocent families he had illegally evicted, every desperate plea he had mocked, and every vulnerable community he had tried to destroy for his own greedy amusement. I thought about how he had manipulated my sister and poisoned my parents against me, using my deliberate undercover silence as a weapon to isolate me from my own blood. My posture remained completely relaxed, but my eyes were pure ice. I stared down at him, letting the crushing silence stretch out until his loud, dramatic sobbing quieted into terrified, pathetic whimpers. He looked up at me through his tear-soaked fingers, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. He was searching my face for any sign of the weak, disgraced sister-in-law he thought he knew. He found nothing but the unyielding resolve of a federal agent who had just successfully dismantled a massive criminal enterprise. You lost the right to use that word when you tried to steal from my community, I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. I did not wait for him to formulate another pathetic excuse or offer another useless, desperate bribe. My part of the deep undercover operation was officially concluded. The evidence was completely secured, the digital confessions were permanently recorded, and the high-value targets were completely isolated and neutralized in the room. The trap had snapped entirely shut, and there was no way out for either of them. I reached up with my right hand and casually tapped the small hidden communication earpiece nestled deep inside my left ear. "Breach," I said, the single tactical command cutting sharply through the heavy, stifling air of the judge's private chambers. Less than 2 seconds later, the massive, heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 were violently smashed open by heavily armed federal tactical units. The deafening sound of shattering wood and booming federal commands instantly filled the entire building, bringing Trent's corrupt, untouchable empire crashing down to the floor for good. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 splintered and crashed inward with an explosive force that shook the entire building. Heavily armed federal tactical units poured through the shattered entryway, moving with terrifying precision and coordinated speed. Their heavy black boots slammed against the polished wood floorboards as they fanned out across the wide room, shouting tactical commands that completely shattered the manufactured dignity of the corrupt court. The air was instantly filled with the harsh, blinding glare of tactical flashlights sweeping across the faces of the terrified spectators. The packed gallery instantly descended into absolute pandemonium. The wealthy donors who had been sitting comfortably just moments ago were now scrambling over the wooden pews, crying out in blind panic. The church elders who had looked at me with such holy condemnation were screaming in profound shock, covering their heads and cowering helplessly in the narrow aisles. I watched my mother and father freeze in their front row seats, their faces completely drained of color, as they stared in uncomprehending horror at the sea of tactical vests and federal windbreakers flooding the space around them. My father tried to stand up, assuming his usual posture of arrogant authority, but a stern federal agent immediately pointed a firm gloved finger at him, ordering him to stay seated and keep his hands entirely visible. My father collapsed back into the wooden bench, his jaw hanging open in absolute defeat. A specialized entry team bypassed the gallery entirely and rushed straight up the short wooden steps toward the private judicial chambers. They swarmed into the dimly lit room where Trent was still kneeling on the expensive Persian rug. "Get on the ground! Put your hands behind your back!" A massive agent roared, grabbing Trent by the shoulder of his custom-tailored suit and violently shoving him face down into the carpet. The arrogant lawyer who had spent his entire career destroying innocent lives did not fight back. He did not utter a single word of legal protest. He simply lay there weeping openly as cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. In the corner of the room, Judge Wallace was still clutching a handful of shredded bank documents, his eyes wide and vacant. "Drop the papers now," the lead agent commanded, stepping forward and ripping the destroyed evidence from the trembling hands of the corrupt magistrate. Wallace let out a high-pitched, pathetic wail as 2 agents grabbed his arms, twisting them forcefully behind his back. The man who had ruthlessly presided over countless rigged hearings was now sobbing uncontrollably, his white dress shirt stained with nervous sweat as the cuffs clicked securely into place. His discarded black robes lay trampled on the floor, totally forgotten. The agents hauled Trent and Wallace to their feet, dragging them roughly out of the private chambers and back into the main well of the courtroom. The sight of the untouchable legal king and the powerful judge being paraded like common criminals sent a massive shockwave through the remaining spectators. The entire room fell into a stunned, breathless silence, broken only by the sound of Trent's ragged sobbing and the heavy rhythmic footsteps of the federal agents. The impenetrable fortress of their corruption had been completely dismantled in less than 60 seconds. Suddenly, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the heavy quiet of the courtroom. Alicia shoved her way past our stunned parents and threw herself toward the central aisle. "Unhand him," she shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her panicked face. "Let him go right now. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." She clawed frantically at the empty air, trying to reach Trent's slumped figure as the agents dragged him past the plaintiff table. "My husband is a senior partner. You cannot do this to us. We will sue every single one of you," she wailed, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged delusion. She was completely unable to accept that her manufactured reality of wealth and status was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She looked back at our parents, pleading for them to intervene, but they remained frozen in terror, unable to process the destruction of their golden child's perfect life. I walked slowly out of the judge's chambers, stepping calmly back into the main well of the courtroom. My posture was perfectly straight, my breathing measured and steady. I watched my sister throw her pathetic tantrum, completely ignoring the stern warnings of the federal agents trying to keep her back. A senior task force agent dressed in a heavy tactical vest walked directly up to me. He did not say a word as he reached into his tactical pouch and handed me a secondary federal warrant printed on thick official paper. I took the document, feeling the physical weight of absolute justice resting firmly in my hand. I walked slowly across the polished floor, closing the distance between myself and my hysterical sister. The agent stepped aside, parting perfectly to let me through. Alicia turned to look at me, her face smeared with expensive mascara and tears of pure, helpless rage. "Valerie, tell them to stop," she demanded, pointing a shaking manicured finger at my chest. "Tell them who Trent is. Make them let him go right now. You have to fix this." I looked deeply into her panicked, wide eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but cold federal resolve. I did not blink as I raised the official warrant so she could clearly see her own name printed in bold black ink across the top margin. "Oh, Alicia," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of mercy. "You are not going home either." Her mouth dropped open in profound shock as the words finally registered in her frantic brain. Her arms fell limply to her sides as the terrible reality of her situation crashed down upon her. "Alicia Benson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and accessory to evidence tampering," I stated clearly, ensuring my voice echoed across the silent courtroom. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The color vanished entirely from her face as a female federal agent stepped forward, grabbing her arms and snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Alicia's wrists, with a sharp metallic finality that echoed through the stunned courtroom. Her perfectly manicured hands were yanked forcefully behind her back, completely ruining the immaculate drape of her expensive silk blouse. She stood there completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words that stubbornly refused to come. The wealthy donors and the pious church elders who had worshipped her just moments ago now physically backed away in absolute horror, treating her as if she carried a highly contagious disease. The impenetrable bubble of her manufactured elite status had burst, leaving her totally exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of federal justice. Reverend Thomas and my mother Yvonne finally broke out of their terrified trance. My father pushed his way past the heavily armed federal agents, his face a twisting mask of profound confusion and desperate, frantic denial. He looked from the agents to me and then to the sobbing wreck of Trent on the floor. "Valerie, what is the absolute meaning of this?" he demanded, his booming preacher's voice trembling with a fragile, sickening panic. "What have you done to your sister? Tell these men to let her go right now. This is a house of God and a court of law. You cannot just walk in here and arrest innocent people." My mother was right behind him, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were pure white. Her eyes darted frantically between my gleaming federal badge and Alicia's handcuffed wrists. She looked at me, not with her usual condescending disappointment, but with genuine pleading terror. "Valerie, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Your sister has done nothing wrong. Trent is a good man. He is saving our church. You have to stop this absolute madness before you ruin everything we have built." I looked at the two people who had given me life, the two people who had completely cast me aside the very moment my existence threatened their proximity to wealth and status. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, absolute authority in my tone made the entire chaotic room fall completely silent. The church elders leaned in. The wealthy donors held their breath, and the federal agents stood like stone statues waiting for me to deliver the final killing blow to the Benson Empire. "Trent is not saving your church," I said, staring directly into my father's eyes, watching his fragile reality begin to fracture and split. "He is the one who engineered its complete destruction. For the last 2 years, he has been secretly draining the community center accounts through untraceable dummy corporations, intentionally driving your beloved congregation into massive, unrecoverable debt. He never wanted to save the historic building or help the community. He deliberately partnered with Judge Wallace to force the property into a corrupt foreclosure so he could buy the prime real estate for pennies on the dollar." My father staggered backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. He grabbed the smooth edge of the wooden pew, his hands shaking violently as he tried to process the crushing magnitude of the betrayal. "A casino." I continued, letting the vile word hang heavy and toxic in the sterile courtroom air. "Your perfect, sophisticated son-in-law was going to bulldoze the sanctuary, the community center, and the neighborhood outreach programs to build a massive luxury casino. He was using your absolute trust, your blind faith, and your desperate, pathetic need for his white wealth and prestige to completely pave over your entire life work." The church elders let out gasps of absolute betrayal, looking down at Trent, who was now weeping pathetically on the floor, completely unable to deny the meticulously documented truth. The older women who had baked for the church fundraisers, and the men who had spent their weekends repairing the community center roof, stared at the bleeding, crying lawyer with pure, unadulterated disgust. But my mother shook her head violently, completely refusing to let go of the golden child narrative she had worshipped for so long. "No," she cried out, pointing a shaking, trembling finger at me. "Alicia would never allow that. She is a good Christian woman. She is my perfect daughter. You are just making this up because you are violently jealous of her success, just like you were 5 years ago when you stole from his law firm." I slowly turned my gaze from my mother to Alicia. My sister tried to shrink away from my icy stare, desperately trying to hide behind the female federal agent holding her arms, but there was nowhere left to run. The spotlight she had always craved was now burning her alive, exposing every ugly, rotten piece of her soul. "I did not steal anything 5 years ago." I stated the absolute truth, ringing out like a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "Your perfect daughter did." Alicia embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from the firm to fund her pathetic obsession with luxury designer clothes and high society status. When the internal auditors caught the missing funds, she completely panicked. She went to Trent crying and begging for him to save her from a lengthy prison sentence. And because Trent desperately needed the image of a flawless, brilliant wife to secure his senior partnership, they made a sinister deal. I stepped closer to my parents, forcing them to look at the devastating reality they had actively participated in for half a decade. "They framed me," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, bitter whisper that carried to every silent corner of the room. "They planted the digital evidence on my workstation, they forged my signature on the offshore transfer documents, and they sat back and watched while I was disbarred, disgraced, and publicly destroyed. And you let them do it. You took one look at Trent's bank account, his expensive imported cars, and his fake societal prestige, and you threw away your only loyal child without a single second thought. You gladly chose the comfortable mirage of wealth over the difficult truth." Alicia let out a gut-wrenching, miserable sob, finally dropping her head in absolute shame, completely unable to look our parents in the eye. Her silence was the ultimate confession. The suffocating tension in the courtroom finally broke. The illusion was entirely dead. The wealthy, pious couple they had idolized and protected were permanently exposed as greedy federal criminals who had gleefully destroyed their own family for money and power. The realization hit Reverend Thomas and Yvonne with the crushing physical force of a collapsing building. The absolute magnitude of their parental failure, the sheer toxic depth of their blinding greed, and their unforgivable betrayal washed over them all at once. My father's legs gave out completely underneath him. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hard wooden floor of the courtroom, bowing his head as loud, agonizing sobs tore through his chest, echoing tragically off the marble walls. My mother collapsed right beside him, her pearl necklace snapping and scattering across the floor as she buried her face in her hands, weeping with a dark, bottomless sorrow. They kneeled there in the center of the ruined courtroom, weeping bitterly for the golden illusion they had worshipped, and the honest, devoted daughter they had so cruelly thrown away forever. The sound of their weeping filled the cavernous courtroom, echoing against the high ceilings and the polished oak benches. It was a pathetic, hollow sound, completely stripped of the righteous authority they had wielded over my life for 30 years. Reverend Thomas, the man whose booming sermons commanded the absolute respect of thousands, was now reduced to a trembling, broken shell of a man. His tailored suit jacket was crumpled, his shoulders heaving with every ragged breath. Beside him, Yvonne, my mother, the woman who had meticulously curated our family image to absolute perfection, looked like a shattered porcelain doll. Her hands clawed desperately at the thick carpet, her perfectly manicured nails catching in the fibers as she sobbed for the absolute destruction of her pristine social standing. The federal agents gave me a wide berth, standing back in respectful silence as they allowed the heavy emotional fallout to settle. I stood perfectly still, watching the two people who had so casually sacrificed my future on the altar of their own ambition. Slowly, agonizingly, my father raised his head. His face was completely wet with tears, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a sudden, desperate realization. He looked at me, not as the disappointment he had actively shunned, but as his only remaining lifeline. He scrambled to his feet, his knees wobbling unsteadily, and took a tentative step toward me. My mother followed, pulling herself up by clutching his arm, her mascara running in dark, jagged lines down her cheeks. "Valerie." My father gasped, his voice completely broken and raspy. "Valerie, please. You have to listen to us." We did not know, he pleaded, reaching a trembling hand out toward me as if hoping I would run into his arms like a frightened child seeking comfort. We had absolutely no idea what Trent was doing to the church or what Alicia did to you 5 years ago. We were completely blind. "Baby, please, you have to believe us. We love you so much. Please come home. Let us make it right." My mother nodded frantically, stepping out from behind him and reaching for my hand. "Yes, sweetie, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with desperate urgency. "We were wrong. We were so terribly wrong about everything. We can fix this. We can be a real family again, just the three of us. You can have your old room back. We will tell the congregation the truth about your sister, and we will celebrate your success. You are a federal agent. You saved the church. You are our hero. Valerie, please just give us another chance to be your parents." I looked down at my mother's outstretched hand, hovering just inches from my own. I did not reach out to take it. I did not flinch or step back. I simply stood my ground, letting her desperate, empty promises fall completely flat in the cold air between us. I felt a profound, absolute emptiness where my desire for their approval used to burn so fiercely. For decades, I had starved myself emotionally, begging for crumbs of their affection, completely twisting myself into knots, trying to prove my worth. But looking at them now, begging me for salvation, only after their golden child had been hauled away in steel handcuffs, I finally understood the absolute truth. They were not crying because they had hurt me. They were crying because they had lost everything else, and I was the only shiny object left in the room for them to claim. I looked directly into the terrified, pleading faces of the people who had completely abandoned me. "You did not know because you did not want to know," I said, my voice dropping to a devastatingly calm, quiet cadence that cut through their frantic sobs like a surgical blade. The signs were always there. The missing money, the fake documents, the sheer impossible reality that a junior paralegal could somehow execute a complex offshore wire transfer without senior authorization. You ignored all of it. You actively chose to look the other way, because acknowledging the truth meant losing your prestigious country club son-in-law and admitting that your perfect golden daughter was a fraud. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I simply raised a single hand, instantly silencing him. You chose the shiny illusion over your own black blood. I continued the heavy, undeniable weight of my words, pressing them both firmly down into their own shame. You looked at Trent with his imported suits and his predatory smile, and you saw salvation. You looked at me, your own flesh and blood, your own dedicated daughter, and you saw nothing but a convenient scapegoat to protect your social standing. You threw me to the wolves without a second thought, completely content to let me drown in debt and disgrace just so you could keep sitting in the front row of high society charity galas. Valerie, no! My mother wailed, taking another desperate step forward but freezing when she met my unyielding stare. I saved your church, I stated plainly, letting the absolute finality of my statement echo through the quiet room. The property is secured. The frozen assets will be returned by the Department of Justice, and your congregation will not lose their spiritual home to a corrupt casino development. I did my job because it was the right thing to do, but I am no longer your daughter. That relationship died the moment you watched me pack my boxes and walk out of your house in tears while you comforted the sister who framed me. You do not get to claim my victory just because your preferred champion turned out to be a federal criminal. The absolute finality of my words struck them both with the force of a physical blow. My mother let out a shrill, devastated cry, clutching her chest as if her heart had literally stopped beating. My father sagged backward, leaning heavily against the wooden pew, completely unable to form a single coherent defense. They both knew in the deepest, darkest corners of their souls that every single word I said was the absolute, irrefutable truth. They had traded their integrity for a comfortable lie, and now the bill had finally come due. I did not wait for another apology or another pathetic attempt at manipulation. The heavy burden of my past, the desperate childhood longing, the years of unacknowledged trauma, and the burning need for revenge were completely lifted from my shoulders. I turned my back on their loud, wailing cries, leaving them alone in the center of the ruined courtroom, surrounded by the shredded remnants of their corrupt legacy. My polished shoes clicked steadily against the hardwood floor, measuring out the final steps of my departure. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of the gallery, leaving the chaotic sounds of federal agents and weeping parents behind me. The long marble corridor of the federal courthouse was cool and quiet, offering a stark, peaceful contrast to the emotional destruction I had just orchestrated. I walked with my head held high, my spine perfectly straight, feeling a deep, expanding sense of absolute liberation with every single step. I pushed through the massive glass front doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the blinding, bright afternoon Atlanta sunlight. The warm Georgia air washed over my face, carrying the sweet scent of blooming magnolias and the distant hum of city traffic. A sleek black federal SUV pulled smoothly up to the curb, stopping precisely at the bottom of the concrete steps. The tinted passenger window rolled down, revealing my field supervisor, giving me a single, respectful nod of acknowledgement. I walked down the steps, feeling the sun warming my dark clothes. I reached down to my belt, casually adjusting my shining federal badge, making sure it sat perfectly straight against my waist. I opened the heavy door of the SUV and climbed into the cool leather interior, pulling the door shut with a solid, definitive thud. As the heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the bustling city traffic, I looked out the tinted window and smiled, knowing I had finally left my toxic past in the dust forever. The most profound lesson we can take away from this story is that true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect and unconditional support, not merely by shared blood or the desperate pursuit of superficial wealth. When people blindly chase an illusion of status and prestige, they inevitably destroy the genuine relationships that actually matter. Valerie's journey teaches us that our self-worth is never determined by the toxic people who fail to recognize it. Ultimate strength comes from knowing your own value, establishing firm boundaries, and having the courage to walk away from those who only bring you pain. Have you ever had to find the courage to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys of justice and self-discovery.